In the deserts of West Asia, there is an animal that seems almost born to defeat death. The Arabian oryx can live for many days without drinking water, lower its activity to save energy, and follow the rare patches of grass that grow after rainfall across the dry, scorched land. But what brought them down was not the heat, thirst, or rocky desert. It was humans. In just a few decades, off-road vehicles and modern rifles turned this symbol of the desert into a species that disappeared from the wild. From the last individuals rescued in captivity, Oman began a risky revival, bringing the oryx back into the wild, protecting them from poaching, and restoring an entire habitat that had been exhausted. Join Mandarin Tech as we explore how humans pulled a species back from extinction and brought the rhythm of life back to the desert. As one of the largest dry regions on Earth, the Arabian Desert stretches across more than 2.3 million square kilometers of West Asia. In summer, surface temperatures can exceed 60 degrees Celsius. Hot winds constantly sweep across the gravel plains, stripping away the last traces of moisture and leaving the ground dry and burning all the way to the horizon. But the desert is not completely a dead land. Life here exists in a very different rhythm. Sparser, shorter-lived, and almost entirely dependent on rare rainfall. After each rain, perennial grasses begin to rise from the dry soil, using roots that can reach 2 to 3 meters deep to touch the hidden layers of moisture below. These tiny patches of green become the starting point for the desert's chain of life, holding on to the little moisture that remains, stabilizing the topsoil, drawing insects and birds back, and then opening the way for grazing animals to follow the first signs of life across the scorched land. Within that harsh ecosystem, the Arabian oryx, also known as the white oryx, was once one of the most recognizable symbols of the Arabian Peninsula. They have a slim body, long legs, and bright white fur that can reflect some of the intense sunlight. Their pale back helps reduce heat absorption, while their widespread hooves allow them to move more easily across soft sand and burning rocky ground. An adult usually weighs around 70 to 90 kilograms, large enough to endure long journeys across the desert. The survival ability of this animal lies in the way it saves every drop of water. Instead of depending on direct water sources, it gets most of the moisture it needs from plants, then travels across very long distances to find areas where grass remains after rainfall. The oryx is usually active at dawn and dusk, when temperatures are more comfortable. At midday, it hides in the shade or uses its hooves to dig through the hot sand and expose the cooler ground underneath. But ironically, the feature that made this white symbol of the desert stand out was also what pushed it to the edge of extinction: its long, straight, almost perfectly symmetrical horns. In many parts of the Arabian Peninsula, oryx horns were once seen as trophies that showed status and power. And when modern rifles and off-road vehicles appeared, this survivor of the desert quickly became a target hunted for generations. For most of history, the oryx population remained relatively stable. People mainly traveled by camel and hunted only on a small scale to meet daily living needs. At that time, the vast land was still large enough for herds of oryx to keep migrating and stay away from humans. Everything truly changed after oil turned the Gulf region of West Asia into one of the fastest developing areas in the world in the mid-20th century. Off-road vehicles began to appear more and more often. High-speed hunting convoys allowed humans to reach areas that had once been almost impossible to access. Many hunts even took place by using off-road vehicles to chase entire herds for many kilometers, until the animals became exhausted under the heat of the desert. In just a few decades, the number of oryx collapsed at a terrifying speed. In the early 20th century, it is estimated that more than 200,000 oryx once moved across the Arabian Peninsula. But by the 1960s, the wild population had fallen to fewer than 500 individuals. By 1972, when the last wild individual was hunted, it officially marked the moment when an animal that had survived for thousands of years in one of the harshest environments on Earth disappeared from the wild. The disappearance of the Arabian oryx was the disappearance of an important link in the already extremely fragile ecosystem of the desert. In many areas, the average annual rainfall is less than 40 millimeters, while vegetation cover is often below 3%. This means that even a small change in the chain of survival can create a major impact on the entire ecosystem. And the oryx was one of the species that helped maintain that balance. As they moved dozens of kilometers across desert regions in search of food, they continuously spread seeds through their droppings and through the fur on their bodies. Many drought-resistant grasses and shrubs depended on this process to expand their range after rare rainy seasons. Not only that, the constant grazing of the oryx also helped maintain the balance of vegetation. In a desert environment without large grazing animals to control biomass, many areas of vegetation can grow densely for a short time and then die off in large numbers, reducing the ability to regenerate in the next rainy season. Scientists began to record the clear weakening of natural seed dispersal routes. Many areas of Oman and Saudi Arabia have up to 44% of their land assessed as severely or very severely degraded. Meanwhile, studies in dryland ecosystems on the Arabian Peninsula show that insect density in some desert areas can drop by more than 50% during long dry seasons because of the lack of food sources and breeding sites. The Hubra bustard, one of the iconic birds of the Arabian desert, declined by 30% from a population of 39,000 individuals in just a few decades due to habitat degradation. This effect also spread upward to the higher levels of the food chain. In Oman, the entire wild population of the Arabian wolf is now only around 100 to 150 individuals. And from that point, humans also began to understand that if they did not act immediately, an entire ecosystem could collapse along with the oryx. When the last Arabian oryx in the wild had been hunted almost to extinction, many people believed there was no way to save them. But just before that moment of despair, a group of international conservationists decided to bet on a bold plan. This campaign later became known as Operation Oryx, one of the most famous wildlife rescue programs in the world. International conservation organizations worked with zoos and regional authorities to begin searching for the last herds of oryx still surviving in the Arabian desert. The remaining individuals were scattered across extremely remote areas of Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Reconnaissance aircraft scanned thousands of square kilometers of desert to look for traces of the remaining oryx herds. Meanwhile, teams on the ground had to travel for days through extreme heat to locate them. In the end, only a very small number of oryx were brought into the breeding program. A few individuals were transferred to Phoenix Zoo in the United States, while others were sent to London Zoo and conservation centers in the Middle East. It may sound hard to believe, but at that time, the entire future of the Arabian oryx depended almost entirely on just a few original founder animals. When the initial population is too small, the risk of inbreeding increases sharply with each generation. Deformities, disease, and declining fertility could have caused the entire program to fail, even if the oryx continued breeding normally during the first few years. Not only that, but oryx born in captivity also gradually lost some of their wild instincts. They became used to stable food supplies, no longer had to constantly migrate to find water, and did not have to face predators as they would in the wild. This made scientists worry that even if the breeding program succeeded, these oryx might no longer be able to survive if they were returned to the desert. From the remaining individuals kept in conservation facilities in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, conservationists began a breeding program that lasted for many years, aiming to increase the population to a large enough number before even thinking about releasing them back into the desert. But the greatest challenge was not reproduction. It was how a species that had become used to living in a cared-for environment could survive again in a hot, water-scarce landscape, where food was almost absent for most of the year. At this point, Oman chose Jidad al-Harasis as the reintroduction site. This was a desert region stretching across thousands of square kilometers, with extremely low population density, few roads, and seasonal vegetation that still grew after rare rainfall. The oryx were not released immediately. At first, they were placed in very large semi-wild enclosures in the middle of the desert. There, direct human contact was reduced as much as possible. Artificial food was also gradually cut back, forcing them to find grass and shrubs on their own and relearn how to travel long distances in search of food. The Oryx herds began to form natural social structures, choose their own leaders, compete for territory, and gradually adapt to Oman's harsh climate. Individuals that were too dependent on humans or did not have enough ability to survive were not selected for full release. By the early 1980s, the final gate was opened. The first 10 Arabian Oryx ran out of the acclimatization enclosure and slowly disappeared into the Omani desert, marking the first time in nearly a decade that the Arabian Oryx had returned to the wild. Over time, scientists began to realize that the return of the Oryx could bring changes to the entire ecosystem around it. As the Oryx herds began moving again across different areas of Oman, they also carried thousands of seeds caught in their fur and digestive system. Migration routes that had disappeared for many years now began working again like biological currents running through the dry desert. Many areas began to show more patches of grass and small shrubs after the rainy season. Although this change happened slowly and was difficult to notice with the naked eye, for ecologists, it was a sign that the natural regeneration cycle was gradually starting to work again. In areas that had almost become bare gravel plains, post-rain vegetation cover increased by up to 20% in some places compared with the period before reintroduction. And as vegetation increased, other forms of life also began to return. Birds started appearing in areas that had once been almost empty. Small rodents and reptiles also gradually expanded their living range thanks to a richer food supply than before. This effect continued to spread upward to the higher levels of the food chain. Predators began appearing again around areas where Oryx herds lived. This may seem dangerous for the Oryx, but in reality, it is a sign of a healthier ecosystem. In nature, the presence of predators shows that the environment has become stable enough to support many different layers of life, and the clearest result was seen in the Oryx population itself. From only 10 individuals first reintroduced in the early 1980s, the number of Oryx in Oman has risen to more than 1,000, turning a plan once seen as almost impossible into one of the most impressive wildlife revival stories in the world. Although bringing the Arabian Oryx back to the desert is considered one of the major successes of modern conservation, this story still does not have a safe ending. After escaping the risk of disappearance, this animal now has to face a desert that is changing faster than ever before. Climate change is making droughts last longer, average temperatures rise higher, and rainfall, already rare, become even harder to predict. For the Oryx, this does not only mean harsher weather, it also means that the seasonal patches of grass and shrubs, the food source that determines their ability to survive, may appear later, become scarcer, or disappear completely in some areas. At the same time, infrastructure development across the Arabian Peninsula is creating another challenge. Highways, border fences, oil and gas fields, and industrial zones are expanding across lands that were once natural movement routes for wildlife. For humans, this is a sign of economic growth. But for the Oryx, these structures can become giant barriers, cutting herds off from the food sources, water sources, and habitats they need to survive in the long term. Even so, hope has not stopped. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and many other countries are continuing to expand reintroduction programs, build protected areas, and develop populations large enough to sustain themselves in the wild. The goal now is not only to keep the Arabian Oryx from going extinct again, but to return them to their true ecological role: a large grazing animal, a link in seed dispersal, and a sign that the desert still has the ability to recover. Today, the Arabian Oryx is no longer just a rare animal saved from the edge of disappearance. It has become proof that nature can still return, if humans stop in time, correct their mistakes, and give life a second chance. Once declared extinct in the wild, the Arabian Oryx has now returned to the desert regions where its ancestors once roamed for thousands of years. But this story is not only about one species of Oryx. It reminds us that humans can push an entire ecosystem to the edge of collapse in just a few decades. But in some cases, humans can also give nature a chance to recover. And the biggest question is, will the Arabian Oryx become a symbol of nature's return in the 21st century? Or will it remain a rare exception among so many species that have disappeared forever? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Mandarin Tech so you won't miss the next fascinating stories.